What's up, guys? JD here, and on today's show, I am talking with Ghassan Halazon, founder and CEO of Emerge Commerce. Ghassan was actually one of the very first guests on this podcast, but it was so long ago that I can't even find that episode in the feed. So for most of you, this is the first time you're going to be hearing from Ghassan, and this is one of those conversations I absolutely love to have. You know, there is so much content out there in the podcast universe about the what. Like, what business should I start? What's a good idea? But I like to talk about the how. How do you actually do it in the trenches, in the weeds? And these are the conversations that entrepreneurs have when they're just chatting over a beer. Like, hey, you want to buy a company? How do you buy a company? How do you raise money to buy a company? Let's say you take on debt, and then interest rates go up 10%. Now all of a sudden, you're paying $100,000 a month in interest payments. How do you deal with that? What happens if you need to pivot your business? How do you make the decision? How do you split from a business partner? You know, all these things are real life scenarios, and we're going to talk about a lot of that in this episode. This is a masterclass if you are a lover of business or a lover of making money and business growth. I think you're going to love this episode. Before we get to it, if you're new here, my name's Jon Davids. I've helped my clients make over $200 million working with my marketing agencies. You can learn more at jondavids.com. While you're there, get on the newsletter. And if you get any value out of this content, all I ask is that you like, subscribe, tell a friend. That is how we grow, and I really appreciate it. Now let's get to my conversation with Ghassan Halazon. We're live. Ghassan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. Great to be back.
Great to be back is right, because you were one of my very, very first conversations. So I'm grateful that you came back for part two.
and as I said, I think we'll have a little bit more of a spicy educational session here today.
I think so too. So let me just set the scene for the listener. The podcast Making It is really about getting under the fingernails and under the collar in terms of what actually happens when you're building something. And so a lot of the conversations that I enjoy the most are when people come on and they're super real. And yeah, maybe your Instagram content looks one way and your blog posts are awesome, but behind the scenes, we all know it's never quite as it seems. So the conversations that entrepreneurs have over a beer or over a coffee when no one else is listening, those are the conversations I like the most, almost like real strategy sessions where it gets nice and gritty. So that's what I want to do with you today. And you sent over a couple topics ahead of time. So let's get into it. Why don't we talk about, I know you're an e-commerce genius. So let's talk about the e-commerce Amazon aggregator model. So why don't you first explain kind of what that is to people who don't know what that is, and then let's talk about why it just went so wrong.
Well, first, let me start off by saying anytime someone calls me an e-commerce genius, I get humbled pretty quickly right after in the world of e-commerce, which is a world full of trials and tribulations, and that's part of what we want to talk about today. So thank you for that intro. I appreciate it. But as we all are, we continue to learn and grow. So I think to your point on the e-commerce and Amazon aggregator model, first of all, for those of you that haven't heard about this, for your listeners that haven't heard about kind of the trend here, we're talking really about the world of roll-ups in e-commerce, i.e., e-commerce holdco companies. Rolling up, buying, and operating a portfolio of different diversified businesses, whether that's on Amazon or whether that's on Shopify, what people call more like sort of the D2C or direct-to-consumer side. So that is sort of the kind of big picture, let's say, sector or model that we're talking about. In terms of what's happened in that space, it's been a pretty remarkable roller coaster ride for the last couple of years, culminating really lately in a lot of the bigger sort of poster childs of Amazon aggregation and e-commerce aggregation folding or going bankrupt or having to sell in a distressed fashion. You know, the biggest of which is Thrasio, which made a lot of headlines, being the multi-billion-dollar gorilla that was once valued at $10 billion and kind of acquired over 200 different brands and found itself sinking in debt and ultimately went through a sort of a restructuring, a bankruptcy ultimately. So essentially, John, this model, the aggregator model that is, has went through sort of a peak period where e-commerce, once the pandemic hit, as everyone knows, was one of the hottest sectors on earth, and all sorts of businesses indiscriminately rise from a revenue and even from a profitability perspective. So on came the Thracios of the world, raising billions of dollars. I think there was about $16 billion poured into e-commerce aggregation at large over a couple of years there between 2020 and 22.
And that was what, 5 or 10 companies really that did it?
Yeah, no. So I think first of all there was maybe north of 100 aggregators, with sort of the top 10, obviously, as you'd imagine, kind of picking up most of that funding and amassing most of those acquisitions, right? Um, and so those businesses basically kind of jumped on this idea that if we can go and arbitrage the acquisitions of these smaller niche e-commerce brands, put them into a bigger holdco, help them save costs, help them improve, kind of share logistics, that maybe that would make them all better. And ultimately, the overall holdco would be valued a lot more than buying any single one of these niche businesses. That was the thesis, at least. And I must say, a lot of the folks that approached it with a banker slash arbitrage mindset. Obviously, when push came to shove, in reality, there's a lot of operational chops that were missing from a lot of these sort of much bigger at scale aggregators. And then, so, of course, when the markets turned and when debt went up, they found themselves in a very challenged position. So that's kind of the kind of 101 of what's happened in that space. And of course, now we're finally seeing this theme or this new trend of consolidators of some sort of strength acquiring other consolidators in a restructuring setting. So, for example, you have Razor Group that's acquired Perch, and there's all sorts of like cleanup work right now in the industry. And there's a lot of return or back to basics in terms of let's maybe zone in where we're winning, and let's kind of move away from conquering the world in terms of like hundreds of categories. That all turned out to be quite unsustainable.
So these names, Thrasio, we mentioned, Razor Group, Perch, Elevate Brands, Moonshot Brands, Seller X, Heyday. I'm just giving you a list of the top 7 or
Right.
so. All these guys, what they all have in common is they raised hundreds of millions or billions of dollars at multi-billion-dollar valuations. And the idea was, let's go find an Amazon seller that sells candles, and we'll find another Amazon seller that sells dog toys, and we'll buy them both. And for some reason, maybe together, they'll be more valuable under our roof. But
Right.
that thesis only works if you're going to fire a bunch of people once you have the acquisition, merge the accounting departments, merge the fulfillment centers. So like the thing that would have cost the candle company $100 now only costs them $30 because they're partnering with the dog toy company to do it.
Right.
So like, but in order for that to work, like you just said, you have to have really strong operational chops. I mean, we're talking about a massive, because these are physical goods too. So you have to know about fulfillment, logistics, sourcing, manufacturing, delivery. I mean, it's kind of a nightmare, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And as I said, like I think quite a bit of quite a few of these larger groups really approached it with an arbitrage mentality. Which again, the math looks nice on paper, but the operational chops are a real thing. And the other variable here is a lot of these businesses were quite reliant on Amazon, and so these are mostly on Amazon brands, so they rely very heavily on how they're ranked on Amazon, how their ad programs work on Amazon, how is Amazon competing with them in some cases, so there's a ton of variables, and so you have to be a master of Amazon on top of everything else, logistics wise. And of course, that's never a sure thing, right? Anytime you're dealing or reliant or beholden by one of these giants, you have things that happen, right? You might wake up one day. There's all sorts of horror stories out there. You get deranked, or you have a couple of your competitors ranking way higher than you suddenly, or getting more favorable treatment for whatever reason. So it's an extremely complex roll-up play, and this brings me to another point to some extent is, and I've seen your show. I'm a fan of your show, and I've seen some folks roll up some really interesting spaces through the years. And obviously, in Canada, one of the poster childs of consolidation at scale is Constellation Software. Kind of a $50 billion software roll-up company. A lot of companies, I find, especially in Canada, tend to say, hey, we're going to be the constellation of X industry or Y industry. And with e-commerce, which we'll get to emerge in a second, we've rolled up a bunch of e-commerce businesses north of 100 million in top line at the peak. We'll talk a little bit about sort of our journey. But back to this, the constellation piece. It is very much not a fair comparison in e-commerce to say something like, we'll be the constellation of e-commerce, especially consumer e-commerce, because you'll find that a lot of these brands are nowhere near as sticky as software, or let's call them boring companies for that matter, right? Generally. So there's software companies, but there's also cash flowing style businesses in the offline world. So there is very much this discrepancy when you're buying stuff that's much more of a roller coaster, right? You have consumers rather than businesses as clients, at least on the one side of the formula. And these consumers act very differently and very inconsistently relative to a boring business that has these, very old school clients, and they're not, kind of mission critical style software, as Constellation calls it. So that's one of the big differentiators in why I think too that, if you go buy a little 4, 5, 8 person shop on Amazon, and those founders aren't retained, and you're jumping in and you have no clue what the Amazon rules are and how to navigate that world, and there's no real synergy, to your point, between brand, pet brand X and kind of candle brand Y, then now most of your variables are off. There's no way you can do it, and then add on the debt situation and the interest rate environment that we're in, and that's just a perfect storm.
And that was an earlier. I mean, one of the reasons that these e-commerce aggregators really blew up is because they started in a zero interest rate environment where money was free. Sure, I can raise $1 billion when it costs me nothing, but now when that $1 billion comes with a 8% interest rate every month, all of a sudden I'm not so willing to give you that money. I want to just hit on this point because this is such a, I think, like 90% of the people I talk to miss this. Everybody wants to build a hold co and they want to buy 15 companies and have them under one nice roof. And then they all point to Constellation and they miss this gigantic matzo ball of a problem when it comes to that analogy, is that Constellation is doing things like adult care facility software, software to run your prison, software to run a hospital, where if that software glitches for even 20 seconds, there's major problems. And so when you have a product like that, people sign up and they literally stick with you for 20 years and they don't go anywhere. They don't even think about going anywhere because it would be so painful. That's so different from having, like we said, a dog toy shop where, yeah, you're doing great. You're making $3 million this month. That's awesome. But guess what? Some better dog toy comes along and my switching costs is like nothing. Like my dog won't even notice. And so if you want to really roll up and have a business like Constellation with the margins and the growth they have, it has to be a business and a product that people do not switch off. They do not leave.
That's exactly right, John. And I think the other aspect to this is in e-commerce, for most businesses, not all, there's an inventory component. So in other words, when you're buying a business at a multiple of EBITDA in software, you kind of know that at the end of the day, that EBITDA is quite a decent proxy of cash flow, right? And it's a totally different variable if your EBITDA is now having to get flowed back into inventory because you're growing. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you grow, the more you suck into your EBITDA to refinance, new inventory ideas or et cetera, right? So you also have that other aspect of the model that is quite unfavorable. And I think that the other interesting piece here is that in e-commerce roll-ups, because you don't have that stickiness, there's even more of a need to unlock synergies with something like a Constellation software. Actually, they're quite known for leaving these businesses alone. It's a very decentralized setting. There are no real synergies that they're looking for, but they're buying stuff that generally isn't really growing all that much. Their organic growth is below 5%. In some quarters, it's been 2% or even neutral. So for them, that's not the focus here is not to actually make these accelerate. It's just to keep them sticky enough and cash flowy enough while they go buy other stuff. Versus in e-commerce, if you're buying stuff that has nothing to do with each other, but you have all these other hurdles we talked about, you have the inventory problem, you're beholden by your big giant, whether it's Amazon or Facebook. And you have and you're dealing with all these moving parts. And then there's even more of an emphasis to actually find synergies. But the problem is, again, a pet business over there, and keep using the candle business over here, or a cupcake store or what have you. They have nothing to do with each other, and in some cases, their platforms can't even be centralized. So that's another hurdle.
There's so much that people learn the hard way when they try to get into this and buy and buy multiple companies and run them. And the reality is, when you do that, you're so much better off going vertical. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, because we'll get into Tiny and the product that you, or the company you sold to them.
Yep.
Before that, though, I want to get into this point you wrote down about partnering with founders when buying companies, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So in your business, you buy companies, you sell companies, but usually if you're doing well, you're buying companies. And the people that you're buying them from are real people with real emotions and real lives and all that kind of stuff. So I'm really curious, what's an acquisition? It could be real or made up, but what's an acquisition that you would make? And what's a realistic set of challenges that come along with buying a company from somebody else?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think we've had a fair share of case studies through the years. We've bought a number of different companies in various sectors, ranging from pets, groceries, golf, outdoor gear, experiences, and travel. So we've seen a wide array of sectors. As I said, we had north of 100 and almost 120 million in gross sales across the portfolio at the peak, before we made certain decisions to focus on specific verticals and kind of go back to basics, as I was talking a little bit about the sector. And in each of those cases, generally our default setting was to retain the founders, partner with them over a couple of years generally, and give them room to continue to grow as they had been when we acquired them. Remember, we as Emerge really kind of raised most of our capital and made most of our acquisitions at the peak. And that worked out against us, as it has with many other e-commerce roll-up stories. But we had bought businesses when they had just shown explosiveness that got everyone excited about the sector, right? So when we were coming in, and I'll give a public example, for example, with True Local, that was a business that had shot up from 8 million in revenue to 20 million in revenue in a span of 12 months organically. And that's a young business. It jumps to 20. Now there's an expectation in this new world, and not only an expectation from us and the founders, but also an expectation about the e-commerce sector. Like when the world shut down, we all thought e-commerce was going from 10% penetration to 30, 40, 50% penetration. But the reality turned out to be more like, well, yes, e-commerce is growing, but the world came back to its senses, and there's a bit more of a equilibrium between retail and offline and e-commerce. And yes, the sector is growing, but it's not growing to the point you thought it would be, right? So now you have to recalibrate. But you're in an interesting conundrum, because there was a sense that this was just going to be growth and growth and growth as time went by. But turns out we got to recalibrate and make the hard decisions to right size the company for where we are at in the now. So what turned out with True Local, for example, is kind of it grew to 20, but then it came down from the peak, like with almost every other e-commerce company in the world, came down from the peak. But in our case, and a testament really to the brand and to the quality of the business, we're still way higher than we were at pre-pandemic. So we're somewhere in between the 8 and the 20, but on a sort of a more normalized growth curve, it's as though 8 grew to 10 to 12 to 14 to 16 million over 3-4 years, right? So it kind of naturally went into that standard kind of growth curve if you modeled it out that way. But we are still below the peak pandemic, and what that ends up meaning is, again, you got to work through this. Like some founders, in some cases, our stories, some founders viewed this as, well, you know what? I'm not into the, let's say, cleanup mode and right size mode. In some cases, we've parted ways with founders, and they've done their job in the growth story, and they're still shareholders and supporters of the company. In other cases, we've built businesses that have continued to grow or kind of stabilized and started to grow again, and we continue to work with some of these founders. So I think that generally, what you got to do is treat people right, but you also have to recognize these founders that have exited their businesses for the most part don't have the same motivation anymore. They have other motivations. They want to start other companies. And from your perspective, the cleanup work that you want to do, you're probably better suited for than expecting a founder that's already cashed out to continue down sort of that cleanup phase.
All right, that was super diplomatic, honest but diplomatic. So let me translate that. So here's I can see two problems. I can see two problems. So the first problem I see is, yes, somebody comes in and they feel one way emotionally when they sell the company, and then the transaction goes through, the cash hits their bank account, and two things happen. A, I feel a lot less pressure than I did the day before because
Yeah,
now I've got a whole bunch of cash sitting in my
yeah,
checking account,
yeah,
so I can
yeah,
sleep easy at night. So that's number one. That makes me feel a little less inclined to work as hard and work at the same hours. And also, not just that, but the the vision I thought I had for myself. I want to build a 10 million, 20 million, $100 million company. That might change when I've got $4 million sitting in my bank account, because all of a sudden, like, well, is that really my motivation, or was I just saying that to help me drive through in the early days? But actually, if I'm making 30 grand a month, I'm fine. I'm
hmm
sailing.
hmm
So there's the reality of what the work is actually going to be and how motivated am I going to be at that time, and is my
yeah.
vision what it was. So, and you kind of have to deal with all that. But what I'm curious about is, when you actually make an acquisition, how often does it work out with the entrepreneur? Like, if I had to
Yeah.
guess, I'd say like maybe 10% of the time, 20% of the time,
Yeah.
80% of the time, they're just not fit to stay.
John, I'll tell you, like, I think sometimes your gut gives you, I think you should follow your instinct with this sort of stuff, right? I think a lot of times, if intentions are clear from the beginning, most people uh, tend to talk about upside a lot more when you're buying a company, right? Like, think of it. I come to you and you have a cash flowing business, and we talk about the terms, and we're talking about an earnout, and we're talking about a 2 or 3 year earnout, and you want to sell your company. So you're talking to me about how you're going to meet your goals for the upside and get me excited that you want to hit your earnout. So you want the goals to be achievable, but we're going to grow. We're going to grow top line. We're going to grow profit. And this is how I make my earnout. And you're ultimately left with a bigger company. And I'm also focused on making sure you still want to sell to me. So if I'm starting to talk to you early about, hey, listen, if you don't meet your goals, we're cutting your, kind of your exec team, we're cutting, all these perks. Like, if we start having that conversation, it feels like, you sort of risk, especially if the seller is potentially speaking to other groups, if you're all that's you're focused on, you might deter them, right? Because remember, a lot of times these founders are pitching to their staff and their people that this acquisition is the right choice. This is what's going to take us to the next level. This is why we're doing this deal. In some cases, in many cases, I should say, they really care about their teams, and they want to make sure their teams are in good shape too. So it kind of poses this sort of gray area where it's like, how much do you want to talk about downside while you're about to do a deal, right? But I will
You
tell
don't
you
talk
something.
about divorce when you're proposing to your
That's right.
fiance.
Exactly, which is kind of a bit of the prenup dilemma, right? So in that sense, if I look at I'll give you an example of something that I thought worked quite neat. And you mentioned, the wholesale pet business that we sold to Tiny. Those founders, and I should say a founder and a professional CEO joined us at the time of acquisition. 20-year-old business, old school guys, know everything about the pet industry. They run their business with great ethics and a good moral compass. They deliver. They almost always deliver more than they promise, right? And despite the headwinds, they too it was an example there where they too came off from their peak pandemic. So again, superstars for 20 years. It wasn't them when the peak went up. It wasn't because of them, and when it came down, it wasn't because of them, right? However, we found ways to make a win-win out of the situation. We decided, the pet business out of Virginia had nothing to do with our core Canadian business of grocery and golf, where we're winning. And we'll talk about that shortly. And so when we made the decision, ultimately selling the business to Tiny, they were team players. We worked out. They had some, sort of deferred consideration that was owed to them. Not exactly earn out, but kind of guaranteed payout as part of the overall purchase price.
Money
We
that you
weren't.
were going to pay the wholesalepet.com people that you hadn't paid them yet.
Correct, correct. And they effectively, in support of doing a deal that was probably better for them overall, for their team, for their continuity under a bigger company like Tiny, a $500 million business. That they played team ball, and we struck a deal there that even though it was better for us from a math perspective, they knew that it was going to be good for them to be under the Tiny business. And so, listen, you find situations where these founders, everyone's happy in good times, right? If things are flowing, there's nothing to talk about. And I always told people, when we buy your business, I would much rather not be involved at all. If you're doing what you say you will, we price this business on what you told me you're going to do. So just do that, and you will not hear from me, right? But if things go sideways, and a lot of times they will, not because these guys are being complacent or otherwise. Maybe there's a bit of that. I don't know. But it goes sideways because in this case, the world went sideways versus what was going on for peak pandemic, which was favorable to them. And when that happens, we got to come together and say, okay, 20 was supposed to go to 30. Instead, it went to 15. That's got to mean something's got to change cost wise or strategy wise, right? And those are the tough discussions to have with founders that potentially view this as more, give me my space. I grew this company, rightfully so, right? Rightfully so. They have pride in it. They want to take care of their teams. They're doing the right thing from their own vantage point. But we got an overall business to run. And like I said earlier, exacerbated by higher debt and interest cost, which means we got to be even more efficient than we would have been under a single company.
There's this glamorous surface that we think about when you think about Warren Buffett or Andrew Wilkinson at Tiny, who you sold to, or the Gandalf character from Constellation. I can't remember his name. What's his name?
I'm not sure.
Who runs Constellation Software?
Mark Leonard. Sorry.
Yeah, Mark Leonard. Exactly.
Yeah,
Well,
with the
people call him
beard
Gandalf because that's what he looks like. So there's this glamour that comes along where we just think these people sit on their couches and read books all day, and that's kind of the PR image that comes along with it. But you're giving a much more real take, which is that you're the guy who has to be the good guy when the acquisition is going through, and also the super bad guy when that acquisition you just made is not going well at all. And you got to have a really tough conversation with a founder who, hey, Ghassan, we're buddies though. Like, remember we had that beer and you told me you're going to leave me alone, but now you want to come in and see my books and talk about my cost structure. And that's got to put you in a pretty tough position. Like, is that what it's like, or am I making it sound worse than it is?
Well, normally I remind them that I just made them millionaires a couple of years ago, and now I got to clean up. I got to deal with the baggage, right? And so from my perspective, and everyone has a perspective. My perspective is, listen, if we jumped into something and we thought it was growing to X or Y, it would have been amazing if everything happened as planned. Now it hasn't happened as planned. No one's fault. It's not a blame game, as I always say. Now we got to recalibrate. We got to fix this model to match the realities of where we are today. And that's what we do. And I think Emerge has done a really good job cleaning things up. I'll give you an example of, kind of a recent win last year with WagJag. It's a business we acquired from Torstar when Torstar and the Toronto Star had some trouble and was kind of exiting a bunch of digital properties. And so we got a good deal on WagJag, picked it up for close to nothing, and sold it. I think we picked it up for $500K. We ended up selling it for $1 million. Again, this is a small business, but we cleaned things up. We brought it back to where it was at its peak, and ultimately we're able to sell it. Again, the cleanup work is, I think, we found we know how to do. It's the boring stuff. It's the roll your sleeve stuff up. But this cleanup work is not the same work that, let's say, a young founder that found success, found growth, sold the company. That may not be kind of where they want to spend their time or where their expertise is, quite frankly. So it's fair game.
It's so different, and it's such a different skill. And you came from the world of being a founder, young entrepreneur, and now you're running this holdco. I want to hit on a couple more things. So tell me about making the sale to Tiny. Who do you talk to? How do you actually sell a business like that? Who do you talk to? What's that first conversation like? How do you prep if things don't go your way? How long is the negotiation? Take us inside.
Yeah, so I mean, when we made the choice to exit wholesale pet, which was our only, I should say this, is it was our only B2B marketplace. Everything else we have in grocery and golf is on the consumer side. So that was a strategic decision. We said, look, we had a fair amount of debt that we wanted to clean out, and we felt that wholesale pet would give us the biggest chance to get a disproportionate amount of cash to pay down this debt and give us a sort of a refresh on our grocery and golf side. So we looked at a few potential buyers. Obviously, we had heard and know the tiny folks. We reached out with the profile. It sells itself, right? It's a tight group. There's like 8, 9 employees at Wholesale Pet, highly profitable, been around for 20 years, no inventory. So it's very cash flow generative, very consistently writing us checks back to HQ, 200, 250K without fail every month in cash flow straight back to Holdco. And so we knew these attributes would attract someone like a Tiny. Ultimately kind of going through that deal was a bit more cumbersome than I expected.
Did
Nothing
you
against.
already know the tiny people before this, or is it the first intro?
Yeah, I'd met one of the principals and kind of reached out saying, "Look, we're exploring our options for this business. I know what you guys like and how you like it, and I can tell you, like Wholesale Pet's a quality cash flowy business." And so they were quick to respond and kind of went through, the exclusivity period and decided to go with them. Obviously, after exploring a few other opportunities, but we knew they were good for it. We knew they had a track record to close these deals, and we went through it. Um,
You said it
Little
got
did I
messy.
know.
So what got messy in there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it got too messy. Other than we were transitioning out into a new CFO, which timing just aligned between that and between Q4 being the craziest time for e-commerce, as you know. So it's a lot of juggling, and I think the DD was actually extremely intensive. Now they may have their reasons on it. I would have thought a deal like this would have closed, kind of much quicker, especially with a company that was acquisitive. But actually, we started in September. I think we signed an LOI in October. There was a bit of back and forth somewhere in the middle, market conditions and so forth. Essentially, we closed the deal by end of January, which, listen, doesn't
And you
sound
started in
crazy.
August,
I know we started talking in September. I think we signed
September.
exclusively in October.
So
Right.
Tiny has this reputation of doing this super quick due diligence.
Yeah.
Andrew will go on podcasts and say, "Yeah, just you send me
Yeah.
your Stripe account, and I'll get back to you on tomorrow, and I'll tell you
Yeah.
how much I want to buy it for." I guess that's not really what it's like.
It's what it started like. I think, again, nothing against the guys. We had a good relationship. It was a clean transaction, but this was quite a DD effort. It taught me a thing or two about the type of stuff they look to do and how to cover their ass. So I actually think it's very prudent of them to do what they did. But this is not, or at least in my case, was not like a 20 or 30-day close.
So
I
give an
mean,
example. What's something they wanted to see? They want to see bank statements. They want to talk to customers. Like what are some
oh
things that
yeah,
you
definitely,
learned?
definitely all of the above. But on top of that, again, I think it's even circumstantial. Like they had to bring in some tax advisors because their tax guy in house was away for some personal reasons. So we end up dealing with a big three kind of audit firm on making sure the tax stuff was in check. The business obviously had come down from the peak, and I had made sure to say up front, if we're signing an LOI, I want these terms to stick. And obviously, as time went on, market conditions changed. Naturally, they were trying to, kind of come back and figure out whether there are other terms that could be changed. Obviously, we found middle ground in the end and made it happen. But it was a very hands-on type of deal, and we got it done, which is all that matters in the end. And as a result, we're able to pay down our debt. We had a senior debt facility at 25 million. Today it's 5.8 million after all these cleanup efforts. A
And was
big
that from
chunk
the
of
proceeds of Wholesale Pet?
the wholesale pet business, we used about 10 million of that to pay down. But obviously, we kind of cleaned out a few other. We did a few other sales last year, and kind of the culmination of all of that is kind of 25 down to 5.8 million in debt. Which, to our point earlier, that was the number one thing we wanted to optimize for over the last year, and I think we've done a good job of it.
We got to talk about Emerge and the journey you've been on for a few years now. So
Yeah.
it's a TSXV traded company, symbol ecom. So it trades up in Canada on the venture exchange. And at its peak, it was, what was it, 100 million?
Yeah, north 150 million in market cap. Yeah.
150 million market cap. It's come down, and that was obviously an inflated COVID valuation.
Mm.
So the big change strategically, based on the conversation you and I had a couple weeks ago, from my understanding, is that you're switching from this we want to buy everything in e-commerce to no, we want to be vertically integrated and focus on just one or two categories.
Right.
Why did you make that decision? And when you decided to make that decision, what did you do?
Yeah, I mean, taking a little step back here, everything I've talked about today in terms of what's happened in the aggregation world of e-commerce, starting with the Thrasios of the world, obviously ties in a little bit with how we thought of the world as well. You know, we weren't necessarily buying Amazon stores; we were actually more focused on fewer, bigger brands. So, case in point, True Local, which is our meat subscription brand, market leader in Canada, Underpar, the market leader in golf discounted experiences. And even like if you look at some of the other businesses that we sold, you know, the Wag Jags and the Battle Boxes, these are all market leaders. They're niche. They have big brands. So we were a little different in that sense that we believed owning brands was more valuable than owning Amazon stores that didn't have a real brand and community. But we weren't, we weren't perfect either. I mean, we went through the same roller coaster ride that everyone else did. We bought businesses at the peak. We financed those acquisitions with a large amount of debt. That debt was variable rate. When it used to be 8 or 9%, it's now 13%. And I heard you say 8% was a lot for aggregators. I know aggregators that have borrowed at 18%, including Thrasio, by the way, 15 to 18%. So how can you run a model like that? So a lot of these things that hit the space hit us in certain ways. And so when you do two things at the same time, you buy businesses at their peak. Again, no one knew this. Shopify, Amazon, everyone overinvested at the peak, thinking that the peak would be the new start of a huge growth trend. It turned out to be half right, but that half right wasn't good enough, right? It turned out that e-commerce is growing, but it's not growing anywhere near you thought it would be, right? So you had all of these things happening at the exact same time while being a public company. And to us, what we found was even though we had scaled from 10 million in revenues, just under 10 million in revenues at the time we went public, to north of 120 million in gross sales. When we acquired all of these businesses, we had, almost 5 verticals, and we generated EBITDA. I mean, we had reported just under $4 million in official EBITDA. That's including HQ and public costs. And when all of that happened and was put together, we realized something pretty quickly, that despite all the vanity metrics saying that we've exceeded 100, saying that we have EBITDA positive, which I know a year ago we would say EBITDA wasn't vanity. Now it is vanity. And I'll tell you why, because obviously at the end of the day, cash flow is what matters. So in our world, I think the markets realized, and we did as well along the way, that regardless of what revenue or EBITDA you have, at the end of the day, if your debt is at the point where the interest payments are sucking out the cash flow of the business, then there's not much equity value left for equity holders. And that's why that was reflected in the share price. So over a year or so ago, we said, screw this top line 100 million stuff, screw EBITDA positive for the sake of EBITDA positive. Let us fix the balance sheet and let's double down where we're winning, because every single one of the brands we've bought, we believe have a very interesting opportunity, but you need the focus to drive that change. And so we embarked on this sort of debt reduction mission, kind of over the last 14, 15 months. And the result is our senior debt is down from 25 million to 5.8 million. We just announced a convertible note conversion into equity at a 200% premium to share price. So we have very supportive note holders. So we converted another 1.4 million just as late as last week, announced last week. And so and then, by the way, the deferred payments that I mentioned owed to brands at the peak, we had 7 million owed to brands, and that's all basically wiped out with the exception of a few $100,000. So we have a radical cleanup of debt on that side. And then on the other pillar, we said, look, the grocery business, specifically the True Local business, which is a terrific
Just
brand.
pause there before this other pillar, because the first pillar that you mentioned is actually pretty pretty stark. The reality is, it was not about revenue or cash flow or EBITDA or anything. It was the debt that was weighing you down. You just had a
Yeah.
balance sheet that was
Yeah.
crushing you.
Yes.
And so realizing that, saying, listen, it doesn't matter how much we make here, we can't get the cash flow high enough to operate this business in a
Yes.
meaningful way if we have this ridiculous amount of debt. And can we
Correct.
just talk for a second about EBITDA versus cash flow? Because
Yeah.
EBITDA, so my understanding, and EBITDA, for those who don't know, it's earnings before interest, taxation, depreciation, amortization. It's earnings before all your expenses, before all
Yes.
your real expenses. And Charlie Munger would call those bullshit earnings, because
Yes.
it's not actual money that you can, pay your
Right.
bills with. It's money that you can put on paper. And
Right.
just for a bit of a history lesson, I think I might be getting this wrong, but I think it was John Malone of Liberty
Right.
who was it
Right.
that? So back in the 80s, when he was basically figuring out ways to buy all these cable companies, these satellite companies,
Right.
he would get great financing by using the EBITDA number to show, hey, what we're doing is working. So it's not like we have a lot of cash in the
Yeah.
bank, but look, our EBITDA before we pay all of our taxes and debt payments,
Yeah.
that number is really good. But you
Yeah.
can't pay your bills with fake money. You actually need cash flow.
Right. Right. Especially if you're going to be a serial acquirer and you're going to use debt, then interest is an ongoing part of the equation, right? So why are you excluding it? Right? If you did a one-off transaction, you've never done it before, fair, I get that. But if interest is just part of your DNA, because that's a part of your DNA, because you're going to be acquiring companies as part of your DNA, then you should be looking at the full cash flow picture. And to your point, we reported almost double the cash flow from operations in 23 that we did in 22. We just announced our 2023 numbers. We had $2 million in cash flow from operations versus $1,000,001 in 2022. So our CFO, or cash flow from operations, have actually done very well as we've cleaned up costs, as we've driven, more effective, kind of revenues and gross margin. So all of this stuff has improved, but that's no match for, let's call it, $3 million in interest payments for debt, right? Doesn't matter. So what we've now done is recalibrated the balance sheet, paid all of that debt down. Obviously, we believe interest rates are on the cusp of dropping, at least in Canada, sooner than the US, it sounds like. So that's going to be a tailwind. Just like it hurt us on the way up, it's gonna hopefully help us on the way down. But most importantly, John, is the decision to focus. I can't tell you how liberating that decision has been, to not have to wake up to, again, when it's good times and everyone's rolling, there's nothing to talk about in a holdco. But if you wake up and there's storms in every one of these brands, and every one of these founders slash, kind of brand operators has issues, challenges, China supply chain issues, comp issues, people leaving because the upside isn't there, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine dealing with all of that at scale versus spending all your time and energy on one or two businesses and really making sure the customer experience is unbelievable. You're doing your merchandising better than anyone. Your images are amazing. You're hiring and retaining top talent. So for us, that there is an allure to going and zooming in on a few areas that we could actually win at in a big way versus being diversified and sitting on a holdco.
The sexiness that everybody thinks about with a holdco and having multiple companies under one umbrella, and that's something that was your thesis also when you started Emerge. You're going to
Right.
buy and hold
Right.
and grow. It sounds like you've done a total 180, and at this point, you're saying, I just want to own a company that
Yeah.
sells one product. Is
Yeah.
that kind of where your head's at right now?
Well, right. I hereby declare that e-commerce aggregation or e-commerce roll-ups are officially dead. And I say that considering myself one of the founders of e-commerce aggregation. I started this journey in 2016. We only heard of Thrasio by 2018-19. So I was on the hunt to buy and build a diversified portfolio of consumer e-commerce businesses. And it is unequivocally clear that consumer e-commerce, for all the reasons and the challenges I mentioned, the lack of stickiness in consumer, the problems with being beholden by a giant, right? The fact that inventory makes EBITDA nowhere near what cash flow is, the fact there aren't any synergies between these holdco verticals. All of these reasons make e-commerce a terrible category to aggregate a huge array of verticals. What we've said and what I've said now is, where within our portfolio can we find true winning brands that have stickiness with customers that's disproportionate, that have market leadership positions where we know we have a moat of some sort, where we have supplier and vendor relationships that are long-standing and that we can actually craft and get some real leverage out of, where we have margin strength, pricing power, things back to basic things that make a business what it is from a full potential standpoint. And that's why we're zoned in on True Local, and that's why we're zoned in on the golf business.
I always like to ask founders, entrepreneurs, business owners who are in the middle of a journey, especially when they're at a turning point or a milestone, if you had to start today and you could start from a clean slate, what would you do? Would you do exactly what you're doing right now, or would you actually start from a different point?
It's a very good question. I think right now, if I'm talking e-commerce, I would certainly go vertical specific, as I said, right? I would not go the roll-up route and buy diversified businesses. If I wanted to take on an M&A strategy in e-commerce, I would go sector specific, right? So within food tech, for example, let's take True Local, we would certainly consider acquiring other companies within the meat space. That's not something Emerge had done. We were buying different verticals that were decentralized, that had nothing to do with each other. So for one, if I were to do roll-ups in e-commerce, I would take one specific vertical and roll it up. So it could be food tech only, it could be pet only, it could be golf only, but I would focus on one and build it up to real scale. The other issue of a holdco, people don't think about this, is if you're a diversified holdco, there's no one to really sell your business to eventually. Now, unless you want to operate for 100 years, right, a la Constellation, a la Berkshire, right? And everyone starts that way, but believe me, 4, 5, 6, 7 years in, you may want to do something else in life. There's no one to buy a holdco with pet products and candles and meat, right? That doesn't work that way. So if you're vertical specific and you build scale, you are a much more strategic business, therefore more likely to find buyers that can make sense of your collection of strategic assets within a vertical versus being broad, right? So that's another added plus for going vertical specific. And then also there's the other thought, which is, if I were to roll up on a diverse, if I were to do a holdco again, ever again, I would definitely do it in software and or in boring businesses that have the attributes of cash flow, like real cash flow today.
I'm going to just give a definition there. Boring businesses, because everyone knows the term boring businesses. It's one of those words that's super hot right now. If I have to define a boring business, it's a business that has a very, very strong stickiness to it, where people don't leave. And it could be something as simple as a laundromat or a car wash, where the geography of it is sticky. If there's a laundromat 3 feet from my door, that is the laundromat I'm going to go to every single time. And that's what makes it a great business. It's not that it's boring that makes it a great business. It's that it's sticky and that it's what I would call low temperature. It's not a business that is really dramatic and high paced and frantic. It's super simple and super sticky.
Right. It's boring in every way except the cash flow that it brings, right?
That's it. That's a great way to end it, man. All right, this is the second appearance for Ghassan. We'll do it a third time for sure. Where can they follow you? Where can they find you?
Thank you. Ghassan Halazon on LinkedIn, and at Instag, INSTAJEE on Instagram and X.
Awesome. Ghassan, thanks so much.
Thank you. Awesome. I enjoyed this and would love to do a third time when I have more to report back.